Hello. The legal and regulatory environment is going to shape the development of digital currencies enormously, and no more so than in the area of non-fungible tokens, or NFTs as they're known. And therefore, I am delighted to introduce Charlie Kerrigan to you today. Charlie is from the eminent city law firm CMS, who are doing an awful lot of work in this arena. He himself is a leading legal influencer in blockchain, digital assets, and an author, and has also had a hand in the CMS publication NF2 Squared, which is both entertaining and highly informative on the subject, and I commend it to you. And I also hope after his talk today, I'm going to know how to make $65 million or so from selling 500 of my Instagram snaps online. But more of that later. Charlie, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Philip. I think that's why we're all here. So I'll start with the principles behind NFTs, and the starting point, I think, from a legal and regulatory perspective is the principle of fungibility. So this is a conventional place from which we start, and fungibility in the finance world is well understood. So if I have a £50 note, it is a negotiable instrument. Title passes by delivery. I can hand it to you, and title to that instrument passes. I can also deposit my £50 note in my bank, and my bank is not obliged to hold my £50 note for me. In fact, it will put the cash onto its balance sheet and substitute that for a liability owed back to me. So we can see that the cash is fungible. Now, non-fungible tokens are clearly the opposite of that. And the reason that they get their name is that they are a digital representation of something which is unique. And the earliest use cases, as you referenced, Philip, have been in the art world. We're also seeing use cases in sports. That can be videos of sports, or it can be something more substantive in the sense of using NFTs of tickets to combat issues of fraud. So we've got use cases that are floating around for NFTs that are bringing them to the mainstream. There are other use cases that are more closely associated with the plumbing of financial markets. And for example, documents can be certified by conversion into NFTs. So the use cases are as broad as they are long. They derive from the fact that we've found a way in the crypto world of attaching value to something because of its uniqueness. And that is a change from our starting point in crypto. We've generally had a background where assets in the crypto world have been fungible. So if we think about Bitcoins, one Bitcoin can be traded for another Bitcoin in Bitcoin lending transactions. By and large, the obligation is not to return the same Bitcoin as those that are transferred. Now, we do have some quirks in relation to that because not all Bitcoin are equal. And in fact, we can see that there is a premium in the market for newly minted Bitcoins. And the reason for that is that there is less requirement to do diligence about the history of that coin. And coins that have touched the dark web are more difficult to use because participants in the mainstream financial markets may be less inclined to accept them as cash. So when we look at crypto, it is starting to sort of break down some of the historic notions that we had around fungibility. We got a starting point where crypto looks like it can be fungible, but with qualifications in practice, as I described. And then we also see a desire to develop something like a non-fungible token in order to take advantage of the fact that the scarcity value of things, particularly in an environment where there are lots of retail traders, is something that can drive a market, particularly a retail market. But again, we see the market breaks down into different sub-markets. So the high-end art example that you used, people's NFT collage that was produced and sold for that very high price, I think is a sui generis type product. We see far more use cases of NFTs in relation to relatively cheap assets. So these are fun, colorful video characters. And a lot of the work that's being done is to produce a real world asset in virtual form. That may be a bicycle that can be ridden in a virtual world, but is a copy of a bicycle that has brand value in the real world. So the well publicized use cases for NFTs, very high value assets, questions around whether there's a bubble in the market, I think those are valid concerns, but by far the more common examples of use cases are low value customer engagement type assets. And we also see that sort of flowing through into NFTs being used in similar environments to the way that we've seen loyalty points. So in order to help with customer engagement, we see them. And that leads us on to the fact that different kinds of NFTs have different characteristics and may be treated in different ways. So I just touched briefly on a couple of points: intellectual property and financial regulation. So because NFTs are associated with crypto, they acquire some scrutiny in terms of their regulatory treatment. And there are two things that we by and large look at. One, relating to the nature of the assets. And here we're looking at the test that's become conventional in the crypto markets. Is something an exchange token, a utility token, or a security token? I'm using the UK FCA categorization classification there, but by and large, the same test applies for most financial regulators. So the regulators are concerned about those things within the regulatory perimeter, and that's security tokens. So what they're trying to establish is that whilst they're technology agnostic, if we are creating instruments that have characteristics of regulated investments, shares, bonds, those type of things, then they should be subject to the same regulation. So if a token is asset-backed, gives access to rights to dividend income similar, that will very likely be a security token and be regulated. Most NFTs are some way from that. So a cartoon character, some item of clothing that can be worn in an online world, clearly doesn't have those characteristics of a share or a bond. So an exchange token is something that can be exchanged between participants in a world. A utility token, something that has utility. In other words, it can be contributed to a project to earn rights to use the project. We're far more often looking at NFTs that have got those type of characteristics. Second question for financial regulation, anti-money laundering. And here, again, most jurisdictions have got relatively similar rules looking at the question. In the UK test, if crypto assets are subject to exchange or custody services, then the provider of those services must comply with the AML rules. So two questions there. One, are NFTs crypto assets? We don't yet know. The regulator hasn't pronounced, but it looks like they are likely to say that they are. And therefore, we'll find ourselves in a situation where providers of those custody or exchange services will have to comply with the AML rules and register for the rules. So we kind of know where we are there, but none of that is difficult or problematic as far as platforms are concerned. And then a final point in relation to the legal analysis is, although we see NFTs often used in the context of art, it's important to be clear that many NFTs, most NFTs, I think, don't come with the copyright associated with that art. So they are digital representations of the art, and the NFT holder has effectively a certificate representing their ownership of the art, but they don't have copyright in the art. So in the same way as if you go to a bookshop and buy a book, you can read the book, but you haven't bought the copyright in the book. And that is an obvious point, because there would still be copies of the book left on the shelf. It's less obvious in the case of NFTs, in particular, because we talk about their scarcity, their uniqueness, their original value. But that's not to say that copyright is transferred, and generally it isn't. It can be, depending on the terms of the sale and purchase that's made on the platform. But that, I think, illustrates the fact that one of the things that concerns regulators and some market participants is that people trading in the market may be making assumptions about what they're buying that turn out to be incorrect. And then the final point, which I think is most interesting about NFTs, is they are driving interest and engagement into the decentralized finance ecosystem. So we've had an ecosystem that's grown rapidly there, from very low digit billions of assets that are held on decentralized finance exchanges, now up to high tens of billions of assets. That's generally been a market where only expert traders and people who have a deep expertise and experience in crypto have engaged. But one of the great benefits, I think, of NFTs is that they operate well in those platforms. They can be used as collateral on decentralized finance applications. They often run on the Ethereum blockchain, and the Ethereum blockchain is a programmable smart contract protocol on which most decentralized finance runs. And therefore, these NFTs are providing an insight, an ability to engage for often retail customers who become familiar with DeFi and become curious, and therefore more educated and engaged in relation to that potentially transformational industry that builds a financial system very similar to the one that we have in traditional markets, alongside those markets, but without reference to the third parties and centralized nature of the traditional markets.
So clearly very, very fertile ground for eminent law firms. So thank you for sharing that with us. We've only really just scratched the surface. As I said earlier, if you want to find out more, I would recommend Charlie's paper, NFT Squared, on the CMS website. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for those insights.
My pleasure. Thank you.